welcome to another edition of Lab Matters, a webcast from Kaspersky Lab. I'm here to talk about a very interesting topic with a very interesting researcher in our global research and analysis team, Mr. Roel Schouwenberg. Roel has been tracking the Stuxnet worm and the ramifications of this attack very closely, and I want to start off right off the bat with can you give me just a general high-level overview of what Stuxnet is?
Well, there are lots of aspects to Stuxnet. So, first of all, Stuxnet is a worm, and as we found out quite recently, a couple of weeks before the Virus Bulletin conference, Stuxnet end goal is to sabotage certain devices that you will most likely find at power plants and general factories.
Right.
And it does this using very, very sophisticated techniques because these networks that it's ultimately targeting are disconnected from the internet.
Right. Give me an example of what you mean by sophisticated techniques. What are we finding in Stuxnet that it's not in use in like general purpose malware?
Well, if you just look at the first big thing about Stuxnet is really that Stuxnet exploited 4 zero-day vulnerabilities, and any malware exploiting one previously unknown vulnerability is already quite big news. 2 would have been unprecedented. This is 4, and that's just on the Windows side of things. So that's really, really big.
Right, and the eventual target, like you said, was software that runs these potential industrial plants, a lot of critical infrastructure, perhaps. A lot of that stuff is not connected to the internet. So how exactly does the worm propagate, and what are some of the main propagation techniques?
So the worm can propagate using USB devices, so USB sticks, as well as spread across the network using MS08067 and a shared printer spool of vulnerability, which is now patched in MS10061.
Right. Do we have any evidence at all that what's the origin of this attack and who the eventual targets were, or or is it all just speculation now?
That's a very good question. There are some things inside the worm code that could potentially be considered as evidence leading to something. From my point of view, it's not evidence at all. It could well be stuff that's left in there to send us on a wild goose chase. So far, it's all speculation, and I really think that unless somebody steps forward and claims responsibility for Stuxnet, we will never, ever find out who's behind it.
But it's clear that this is the attackers or whoever is behind the creation and release of Stuxnet and you said this publicly already, enjoys some sort of nation-state backing. And the resources, talk a little bit about what your thoughts are regarding the actual resources that are built, that was used to build into this thing.
Oh, yeah, so Stuxnet is very sophisticated, as I was already mentioning, and it does a whole lot of novel things inside the code. So you really need a team probably from 5 to 10 people who are really top-level experts in their field to find all these different vulnerabilities, know how to work with these industrial control systems and all that stuff. And there must have been months and months of development, as well as testing. Because this is such a complex thing, there has to be lots of testing. They need to be sure that it works correctly. With that in mind, and the fact that it's ultimately cyber-sabotage and not cyber-espionage.
Right.
Nation-state backing is the only likely, or the most likely scenario.
You said cyber-sabotage. Do we know what the end goal was? Or is there any sort of evidence in the code or any sort of pointers in the code that tells us what the attackers may have done or was trying to do?
Well, the problem for us is we don't have the exact machinery, don't have the exact specifications of the hardware, nor do we know the exact configuration that the hardware would be in. So that's very hard.
So it's impossible to really test and figure out exactly what they were trying to do.
The people at INL, which is I forgot what the acronym stands for exactly, but this is a U.S. national R&D with regards to industrial control systems. They set up a test grid for Stuxnet, and they deployed Stuxnet in this test network, and they had machines overload. So that's definitely one potential scenario, but that doesn't give us 100% certainty that that is also exactly what would happen in the wild.
We heard from Microsoft here at the Virus Bulletin conference that Stuxnet, there's evidence that Stuxnet or some parts of the code dates back to January 2009. The first public documentation of this thing as some sort of industrial strength malware came maybe July this year, and a lot of the research has come subsequent to that. Do we have any evidence that this actually officially dates back to how far? Do we know how far Stuxnet itself dates back to? And just to wrap up quickly, can you talk a little bit about where we're seeing the infections and whether it's under control, if it's continuing to spread? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, to tackle the first part of your question, what we've seen indeed is that there are some hints in the code, like compiler dates and so on, that point, at least for the initial variant, to the beginning of last year, actually. And that variant remained under the radar for a very long time. Only since we saw the more sophisticated version, we found out, hey, there is this more, there is this older variant. Having said that, and the fact that the two of these zero-day vulnerabilities aren't quite as zero-day as we first thought, it's very interesting. Given the clues in the code, I would say, estimating everything, this project probably started in 2008 when they were first designing it, and they must have had quite a plan on how to deploy it.
The worm continues to spread today?
Yes, definitely, because it's a worm that spreads on its own. It doesn't await any command from its master. It just keeps on spreading. So while initially in July we saw the majority of attacks, or majority of infections, I should say, in Iran, right now we see the most in India and Indonesia, and the amount of infections in Iran has actually decreased.
Because of these infections and post-cleanup, based on cleanups.
Yes.
Just to end quickly with, what should an industrial network with a SCADA environment that might be under attack think about? How should those network administrators think about defending themselves against Stuxnet type attacks? What are some of the top 3 things that they absolutely should be on top of?
Well, that's a very...
Because it's zero-day. I mean, how do you defend it?
It's a very tough question, because a lot of these networks run on more out-of-date hardware, and these systems have certain hardware limitations. So in some documentation actually says, please do not enable automatic update of antivirus.
Right.
So that's definitely not good, but other than like good patch management, it really makes sense to have good intrusion detection systems as well as honeypots. If you have a fake PLC in your network that you're able to monitor, then you're able to determine very quickly that something is wrong.
So a lot of the traditional defenses can work for this type of...
I think actually that's very much the case. If you take even, let's say, consumer antivirus product, it has a lot of additional features that aren't enabled by default because they are maybe not as user-friendly. But when you're on these critical networks, you can really crank up certain settings, because there will be no legitimate use for certain operations happening in these limited, very controlled.
You expect this to be a story we'll be talking about for the next year?
That's a very good question. I think that will greatly depend on if we see more of this happening.
Thank you very much, Roel. Very interesting information. And thank you for watching another edition of our Lab Matters podcast. Thank you.